In the early 1900s, Germany's U-boat program developed during a period of massive naval expansion. Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz oversaw this buildup, guided by his risk theory. Though he strongly favored surface ships, he reluctantly accepted U-boats for coastal defense as tensions with Britain continued to rise. Early developments were heavily influenced by foreign designs. In 1903, the British Royal Navy commissioned 5 Holland-class submarines built by Vickers. This demonstrated their practical value underwater and prompted the Germans to begin their own observations and experiments. Around the same time, designs by American inventor Simon Lake sparked innovation in the private sector. This indirectly encouraged German shipyards to invest in a U-boat fleet despite official skepticism. The Tirpitz program, officially approved in 1897, allocated very few resources to submarines. They were viewed as mere supplements to battleships, not primary weapons. Nevertheless, this allowed technology to slowly advance at both private and imperial shipyards. On February 23, 1909, the U-13 class U-boats were ordered as part of this expansion. This class included U-13, U-14, and U-15. This represented a step towards building more capable coastal U-boats, perfectly suited for Baltic Sea operations and ambush tactics. These boats evolved from earlier classes. Designers focused heavily on improving surface maneuverability, completely abandoning the goal of achieving a fleet speed of 21 knots. Key features of the U-13 class included a single hull design with a separate outer casing, a flat deck for stability in rough weather, and large surrounding ballast tanks. This greatly improved harbor maneuverability and handling while submerged. For surface propulsion, they used cording kerosene engines, producing a combined 1,200 horsepower. When submerged, the boats employed electric motors, generating 1,160 horsepower. During this transitional period, before diesel engines became standard, the focus was entirely on raw power, not fuel efficiency. Designed primarily for coastal defense and short-range operations in confined waters like the Baltic Sea, these vessels relied on ambush tactics rather than open ocean raids. Each U-boat cost approximately 2,101,000 gold marks, reflecting the highly experimental nature of the program. Construction was handled by the Imperial Shipyard in Danzig. Compared to the earlier U-3 class, the U-13 model offered significant advantages. The vessels were longer, measuring 190 feet compared to 168. Surfaced speed increased to 14.8 knots, up from 11.8. Their range extended to 4,000 nautical miles at a speed of 9 knots, compared to the 3,000 miles of their predecessors. The diving depth was set at 164 feet. Armament remained largely the same, featuring 4 torpedo tubes, 2 in the bow and 2 in the stern, carrying a total of 6 torpedoes. However, their overall effectiveness for sustained combat was vastly improved. The U-14 was ordered on February 23, 1909, as part of the early Imperial German Navy U-boat program. Her keel was laid down in late 1910. This marked the beginning of construction for a U-13 class coastal U-boat that incorporated valuable lessons learned from earlier designs like the U-9 class. Work at the shipyard progressed steadily. The builders paid close attention to the boat's compact hull and internal systems. This reflected a broader Navy-wide push to adopt more reliable kerosene engines over early gasoline power plants, taking all possible measures to minimize fire risk. The U-boat was launched on July 11, 1911, at the Kaiserliche Werft shipyard, after which fitting out began. She was equipped with 2 cording kerosene engines, a 6-cylinder and an 8-cylinder, which produced a total output of 1,200 horsepower while surfaced. For submerged propulsion, she used 2 Siemens-Schuckert electric motors, generating 1,160 horsepower. Her armament consisted of 4 17.7-inch torpedo tubes, 2 in the bow and 2 in the stern, 6 C-06 torpedoes, and 1 4.1-inch deck gun with 300 rounds of ammunition. Fitting out concluded with the setup of electrical and steering systems, preparing the submarine for trials. The U-boat was officially commissioned on April 24, 1912. Immediately after, test sailings began in the Baltic Sea to check stability and the operation of all systems under real conditions. Initial sea trials showed a maximum surface speed of 14.8 knots. This confirmed the submarine's suitability for coastal reconnaissance, though it also revealed the need for minor engine synchronization adjustments. Prior to World War I, after commissioning at the Danzig shipyard, the U-14 submarine joined the submarine forces of the Imperial German Navy for peacetime service. She participated in regular training with the High Seas Fleet, where the crew honed their skills in underwater navigation and tactical maneuvers. They carried out short sorties into the Baltic Sea. There, Type U-13 U-boats, which included the U-14, conducted torpedo firing exercises and tested the reliability of their kerosene engines. The crew of 35 officers and enlisted men took part in large-scale fleet exercises to learn how to coordinate with surface vessels. No major incidents occurred during this period. Only minor engine upgrades were performed to fix small issues discovered during trials. Within the submarine forces of the Imperial Navy, the U-14 was one of the early U-boats. This fleet would eventually grow into a massive armada of 329 submarines. Because the boat was commissioned more than 2 years before the outbreak of hostilities, her crew gained extensive peacetime experience, unlike many other crews who were rushed into service after 1914. The U-14 belonged to the type U-13 and served in the submarine division of the High Seas Fleet before the war. Flotillas at the time focused on developing tactics for the new submarine fleet, which operated as a reconnaissance unit. Before mobilization in July 1914, the U-14 underwent a small refit to ensure full combat readiness. By the summer of 1914, the U-14 submarine was fully operational. She carried a complete crew of 35 officers and enlisted men, along with a standard loadout of 6 torpedoes and enough supplies for a surfaced range of 4,000 nautical miles. When World War I broke out, the U-14 was assigned to the 2nd U-boat flotilla on August 1, 1914. She operated from a forward base in the Heligoland Bight, supporting the defensive positions of the High Seas Fleet in the North Sea. Commanded by Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger from August 1st to December 15, 1914, the submarine focused on defensive operations. Her mission was to counter potential British naval attacks and establish sentry lines across her assigned sectors. These early missions prioritized scouting and protecting the approaches to the German coast, so the U-14 did not go on actual war patrols during this time. While this period is mostly remembered for defensive watchkeeping, her very first wartime mission was actually part of a much more ambitious offensive operation. Just days after war was declared, Naval Command sent out a group of 10 submarines. This included the U-14 and her Type U-13 sister submarines, the U-13 and the U-15. It was a bold attempt to strike the British Grand Fleet at its anchorage in Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. The operation was a disaster for this class of submarines. The U-13 vanished without a trace shortly after leaving Heligoland, likely destroyed by a mine or a mechanical failure. Meanwhile, the U-15 was detected and rammed by the light cruiser HMS Birmingham on August 9, 1914, sinking with her entire crew. The U-14 could not reach the target area and returned without sinking any enemy ships. However, she survived a mission that claimed both of her sister submarines in the very first week of the war. It was a harsh early lesson showing that pre-war submarine tactics and technology were not yet ready for offensive fleet action. Command passed to Captain Lieutenant Otto Droscher on December 17, 1914. He led the U-14 until April 15, 1915, shifting her role to broader scouting operations in the North Sea. This included reporting weather conditions to help with fleet movements and support aviation. The swap in command actually went both ways. Droscher had previously commanded the U-20, which Schwieger now took over. Schwieger's time commanding the U-20 would soon place him at the center of a major historical event. On May 7, 1915, he ordered the single torpedo that sank the RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. This attack killed 1,198 people and drastically increased diplomatic tensions between Germany and the United States. For a brief period, the U-14 served as the training ground for the officer who would later carry out the most controversial attack of the entire submarine campaign. Logistics involved resupplying and maintenance at nearby ports like Wilhelmshaven. The crew was rotated periodically to keep the U-boat fully operational, despite the demanding schedule of the flotilla. Strategically, these early missions were part of Germany's initial attempts to enforce a distant blockade using U-boats. They screened the fleet while following strict rules, like avoiding operations north of the 59th parallel. However, their success remained limited before they escalated to raiding commercial ships. The 1915 patrol and engagements. Prior to this deployment, the U-14 had sustained damage during a British air raid on Zeebrugge on the night of February 1, 1915. Bombs struck the submarine, causing flooding that required temporary repairs and delayed its readiness. Under the command of Lieutenant Max Hammerly, who took charge on April 16, 1915, the submarine departed from the German-occupied base at Zeebrugge, Belgium. It began its only wartime patrol, which lasted until June 5, 1915. The vessel traveled through the North Sea, navigating toward the Scottish coast and reaching waters off Peterhead by early June. By this time, the U-14 had been reassigned to the 1st U-boat flotilla. The first engagement for U-boat U-14 occurred on June 2, 1915, when it torpedoed and sank the Danish steamer Cyrus, a vessel of 1,669 tons, in the North Sea off the Scottish coast. The following day, June 3rd, the submarine encountered the Swedish steamer Lapland, weighing 2,238 tons. After missing with an initial torpedo shot, U-14 surfaced and used its deck gun to sink the vessel. These actions marked the initial successes of the submarine, targeting neutral merchant shipping in the area. On June 5, 1915, about 20 miles east of Peterhead, Scotland, U-14 was surprised on the surface by gunfire from 2 British armed trawlers, HMS Oceanic II and HMS Hawke. The submarine was disabled and sunk. 1 crewman was killed, and 27 survivors were rescued and taken prisoner. Detailing the events of June 5th, during its North Sea patrol, U-14 encountered the British armed trawler Oceanic II off Peterhead. Commanded by Lieutenant Max Hammerly, the submarine surfaced and opened fire on the trawler. Oceanic II was actually operating in disguise as part of an auxiliary patrol to protect fishing fleets. Before it became a direct gun duel, Hammerly had approached Oceanic II on the surface and fired warning shots across its bow. This procedure was still required for German U-boats approaching merchant and fishing vessels under the prize rules of the time. It was only after the fishing boat disguise of Oceanic II fell away and it opened fire with a concealed gun that Hammerly realized the trawler was an armed decoy. Oceanic II immediately returned fire, starting a fierce exchange at close range. This episode was among the earliest demonstrations of the Royal Navy Q-ship concept, where seemingly unarmed trawlers and merchant ships hid weapons to lure submarines into close-range surface battles. The armed trawler Hawke, under Lieutenant H.J. Ferguson, quickly arrived to support Oceanic II after receiving distress signals. The 2 trawlers launched a joint assault using their deck guns and small arms, targeting the exposed conning tower and hull of U-14. Multiple hits crippled the submarine's ability to dive. Damage to critical components like the diving vents and forward tanks caused it to partially submerge. The stern flooded while the bow remained afloat. Hammerly ordered the crew to abandon ship, but the engagement lasted about 20 minutes of intense gunfire before Hawke closed in to ram the vulnerable submarine. U-14 ultimately sank stern first, marking one of the early successes of armed trawlers against German U-boats in home waters. The action demonstrated the effectiveness of decoy tactics, where seemingly defenseless fishing vessels lured surface submarines into gun duels. During the sinking on June 5, 1915, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Max Hammerly, was killed. He was the only fatality among the crew. Out of the complement of 28 men on the submarine, 27 survived, consisting of 6 officers and 21 sailors. Right after the battle, the crews of the British armed trawlers Oceanic II and Hawk rescued the survivors from the water. After the rescue, Royal Navy personnel interrogated the German sailors to gather intelligence on U-boat operations. They were then transferred to prisoner of war camps in Britain, where they remained until the end of the war. British authorities confirmed that the sunken vessel was the U-boat U-14 by inspecting markings on debris recovered from the wreck site. Salvage operations were not conducted due to the moderate depth and the strategic priorities of the naval blockade. The wreck lies upright on the seabed east of the Scottish town of Peterhead at a depth of about 131 feet. This site has not been explored by modern underwater archaeologists, and it does not hold memorial status. U-boat 14 was a coastal submarine of the type U-boat 13 class built for the Imperial German Navy. It had a single-hull steel construction with an outer casing, designed for operations in the relatively shallow depths of the North Sea. The boat had a surface displacement of 569 tons and a submerged displacement of 710 tons. This provided balanced performance for the naval tactics of the time. The overall length was 190 feet, with a beam of 20 feet and a draft of 11 feet. The maximum diving depth reached 164 feet, allowing it to operate safely in coastal waters. The crew consisted of 35 officers and enlisted men, which allowed them to effectively manage all systems during patrols. For surface rescue in emergency situations, a small boat was stored on the superstructure, which was a standard safety requirement for submarines of the early 20th century. As for armament, U-boat 14 had 4 18-inch torpedo tubes, 2 at the bow and 2 at the stern, along with a payload of 6 torpedoes. Additionally, a 4-inch gun with a payload of 300 rounds was mounted on the deck for surface combat against small vessels. U-boat 14 was powered by a kerosene electric propulsion system. It consisted of 4 cording semi-diesel engines, producing a total of 1,200 horsepower for surfaced running. Submerged, the U-boat relied on 2 electric motors, producing 1,100 horsepower. Both systems drove 2 propeller shafts. The surface engines operated at 550 revolutions per minute, while the electric motors ran at 600. This reflected the main goal of the designers, to increase the surface speed compared to earlier models. Although the kerosene engines were reliable for short bursts of speed, they carried a high risk of vapor ignition. Because of this, their use for sustained, high-speed running was limited. During sea trials in 1912, the submarine reached a maximum surface speed of 14.8 knots and a submerged speed of 10.7 knots. Thanks to the improved engines, it outperformed its predecessors, like the U-boat 9 class. Endurance was limited by the fuel supply and battery capacity. The surfaced range was about 4,000 nautical miles at a speed of 9 knots, or 2,000 nautical miles at 14 knots. Submerged, the boat could travel approximately 90 nautical miles at a speed of 5 knots, relying solely on battery power. The fuel supply consisted of about 70 tons of kerosene and paraffin oil. These were stored in special tanks and fueled the surface engines. Submerged, the submarine was powered by 2 groups of lead-acid batteries. They were charged while running on the surface using the cording engine generators. This system offered some freedom of action in coastal waters, but it had a serious drawback. The submarine had to surface frequently to recharge, making it a vulnerable target in dangerous areas. The effectiveness of U-boat 14 was also reduced by its low freeboard and single-hull design. This caused instability in the rough conditions of the North Sea, often forcing the crew to reduce speed or turn into the waves during patrols. During its single combat patrol in 1915, the U-boat 14 submarine sank 2 neutral merchant ships with a total displacement of nearly 4,000 tons. The attacks took place off the coast of Scotland. The targets were unarmed steamers traveling between neutral ports that offered no resistance. Later, these sinkings were confirmed by British Admiralty records based on survivor reports and intelligence data. On June 2, 1915, U-14 torpedoed the Danish steamer Cyrus. This happened about 50 nautical miles east of the Scottish city of Aberdeen. The steamer was carrying a cargo of coal from Scotland to Copenhagen and was attacked without warning. All 20 crew members escaped in lifeboats with no casualties. This was the first confirmed sinking of a merchant vessel credited to U-14. The attack was carried out as efficiently as possible, using only one torpedo to save ammunition. The next day, on June 3rd, U-14 attacked the Swedish steamer Lapland near Peterhead. The vessel was carrying iron ore from Norway to England. The steamer also went to the bottom from a torpedo strike. The 22 crew members escaped with minimal injuries. The captain of the vessel, J.C. Pedersen, reported that due to the suddenness of the attack, they had no chance to resist. These actions demonstrated the tactical flexibility of U-14. Using torpedoes helped compensate for the lack of ammunition, which was a typical problem for early Type 13 U-boats. They carried only 6 torpedoes and had a very limited supply of artillery shells. As one of the early coastal Type 13 U-boats of the Imperial German Navy, U-14 played its part in the beginning of unrestricted submarine warfare. It contributed to Germany's attempts to economically strangle Britain by attacking merchant shipping in the North Sea. During its patrol under the command of Oberleutnant Max Hammerle, the U-boat demonstrated classic merchant fleet hunting, which, although it pressured British supply lines, still yielded limited strategic results. This modest result was just a tiny part of the 1915 submarine campaign. At that time, a total of over 750 vessels were sunk, with a total displacement of about 1 million tons. This proved that Type 13 U-boats were suitable for short-range operations, despite their fragile construction and low endurance. The actions of U-14 perfectly aligned with the broader blockade strategy. Attacks on neutral vessels were meant to exacerbate Britain's import problems, although such sinkings caused international outrage and diplomatic tension, especially in relations with the United States of America. The loss of the submarine on June 5, 1915, from the artillery fire of the armed British trawlers Oceanic II and Hawk, which were acting as decoys near Peterhead, revealed the critical vulnerability of submarines when surfaced. This influenced later British tactics using decoy ships and convinced the Germans of the dangers of a cautious approach under prize rules. During the incident, 1 crew member died and 27 sailors were rescued. This event highlighted the high risks of early patrols and forced the German command to change their doctrine. They shifted to unrestricted submarine warfare and attacks without warning to avoid similar threats. Compared to the more successful U-boats of the 1st and 2nd flotillas, like U-9 under the command of Otto Weddigen, who in September of 1914 sank 3 British cruisers with a total displacement of over 36,000 tons in a single engagement, the results for U-14 were much more modest. This single patrol and its limited successes showed that the effectiveness of early U-boats varied greatly. Small boats of this type proved to be more useful for scouting and raiding auxiliary vessels rather than for decisive battles with the enemy fleet. Post-war analysis of U-14's operations highlighted its significance in the shift from the pre-war doctrine of reconnaissance to the aggressive destruction of merchant vessels. However, the quick loss of this boat underscored the urgent need for better protection against surface ships, the creation of larger, ocean-going models, and improved tactics. It was these changes that shaped the massive U-boat campaigns from 1916 to 1918. The U-14 designation itself appeared 2 more times in 20th century naval history, and these instances are in no way connected to the type U-13 U-boat lost near Peterhead. During that same war, the Austro-Hungarian Navy commissioned its own submarine, U-14. In reality, this was the former French Brumaire-class submarine, the Curie. In December of 1914, it got tangled in harbor defenses while trying to penetrate the Austro-Hungarian base in Pula. The boat was salvaged and put back into service, this time under the Austro-Hungarian flag. From October of 1915, it was commanded for over 2 years by Georg Ritter von Trapp, who later became famous as the head of the family featured in the movie The Sound of Music. A few decades later, the German Kriegsmarine reused this number for a coastal Type 20B U-boat. It joined the fleet in January of 1936 and was scuttled at the end of the Second World War. And the post-war Bundesmarine assigned it once again to a Type 206 U-boat. It was launched in 1973 and decommissioned in 1997. This is a prime example of how the early submarine numbers of the Imperial Navy were actively reused across three different navies of Germany and Austria-Hungary over the following century.